claiming what we protected. Poirot's gaze was cold. And so you killed an innocent man. I didn't know, Edwin cried. I didn't see his face. I only saw the umbrella. You should have seen the truth, Poirot said softly. But your fear was too loud. A silence followed, thick, breathless. Poirot turned at last to Clara, who sat frozen in disbelief. Justice will be yours, mademoiselle, but it will not erase the pain. Tears brimmed in her eyes. He died trying to help me. Poirot gave a quiet nod. And now the full truth is revealed. The lies are unspooled. The rest belongs to the law. Outside the conservatory, the sun dipped lower over Brackenthorp. The roses in the hotel garden, still wet from last night's rain, glowed like lanterns in the golden light, and somewhere inside, the sound of silence, no longer burdened by secrets, finally settled. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The following day, Brackenthorp woke to a strange stillness. The village square, usually scattered with locals discussing the weather and garden yields, held an unnatural hush. News of Edwin Cartwright's implication in Philip Benton's death had spread quickly, but not yet officially. Inspector Cawthorne was proceeding with caution, relying on Hercule Poirot to complete his quiet, surgical dismantling of the case. But Poirot was not quite ready to hand things over. There is still one mask to be removed, he told Hastings, as they walked along the misted banks of the river just beyond the village. One person, very close to the heart of it all, who has not yet shown their true face. Hastings frowned. Surely you mean Cartwright. He confessed, didn't he? Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. He confessed to an act, mon ami, not to a mindset, and certainly not to the entire orchestration of events. No, someone else nudged the pieces before he even realized he was playing a game. They returned to the hotel just after 11. Poirot asked for a quiet room off the lobby, and instructed that Clara Ridley be brought to him. She arrived soon after, wrapped in a wool shawl, her expression weary but grateful. You look as though you have not slept, Poirot said gently. Clara nodded. I haven't. I keep seeing Philip. I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't told him. You told him the truth, Poirot interrupted. You trusted him. That is no crime. But I must ask you something more difficult. Who else did you tell? Clara blinked. No one, except, well, Lillian. A few days before the concert, I told her that Philip had found something, that I might have a claim to the estate. Poirot leaned forward. And how did she respond? She didn't say much, just looked thoughtful, said she hoped I knew what I was doing. Poirot's face darkened. Merci, mademoiselle. That is most helpful. Lillian Cartwright was summoned next. She entered with impeccable posture, the lines of her grey skirt sharply pressed, her hair pinned with unshakable precision. She took her seat across from Poirot and folded her hands in her lap. I assume this is about my father, she said coolly. No, mademoiselle, Poirot replied. This is about you. For the first time, a shadow of hesitation passed across her eyes. I don't know what you mean. Poirot didn't blink. You knew about Clara's claim. You knew Philip Benton had uncovered it. You knew that if Clara inherited the trust, your family's influence in Brackenthorp would crumble, especially your father's legacy." She gave a soft, incredulous laugh. "That's absurd. I never—" Poirot raised a hand. "Mademoiselle, I have studied you, watched you, and what I see is a mind more meticulous than your father's." He was panicked. "You? You were careful. You guided him, fed him doubt, let him believe Clara was the threat." Lillian's lips pressed tightly together. "It was you who planted the forged letter in Clara's drawer," Poirot continued. "You who encouraged your father to see her as a danger. You who quietly staged the cloakroom theft, placing the distinctive umbrella in the path of the victim." "You have no proof," she said, her voice suddenly thinner. "No?" Poirot lifted a small folded handkerchief from the table and unwrapped the black button. "This came from a ceremonial coat belonging to your father, but it was missing long before he admitted involvement. A coat that, I have learned, was often stored in your keeping." Lillian said nothing. Poirot stepped closer. "But even more damning, mademoiselle, is the letter from McInnes and Holt, sent yesterday evening. It confirms that a woman identifying herself as Clara Ridley phoned 2 weeks ago to inquire about the Delaford Trust. A woman whose voice, they now say, was clipped and authoritative, not shy, not hesitant." Lillian's composure began to fracture. "You were the one who pushed this forward. You feared that if Benton succeeded, Clara would gain everything, and your father, your family's reputation, and your social standing would dissolve. He was going to ruin us," she said softly. "No, mademoiselle. He was going to reveal the truth." Her eyes, now glistening, locked with Poirot's. "He was going to hand everything to her. A nobody, an orphan. Do you know what it felt like to see my father's legacy handed to someone he would have dismissed as insignificant? You say that, yet she is your cousin." Lillian stood up. "That doesn't matter. What matters is what we built, what we preserved." Poirot stepped aside as Inspector Cawthorne entered quietly from the hallway behind her, flanked by 2 constables. "Miss Cartwright," the inspector said with grim finality, "I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice." Lillian did not resist. She lifted her chin as though being arrested was a formality beneath her. "I didn't kill him," she said, glancing back at Poirot. "No," Poirot agreed, "but you created the conditions, and you nudged the hand of a weaker man to do what you had already decided was necessary." That evening Poirot and Hastings sat once more in their room at the guest house. "So that's it, then?" Hastings asked. "She manipulated her father, who killed Benton by mistake, thinking it was Clara?" "Oui." "A masterful manipulation. Cool, subtle, buried beneath years of propriety. But ultimately, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Edwin Cartwright was her pawn, but so her undoing." Hastings sighed. "And Clara? She will inherit the trust once the legal matters are resolved. She'll need time to heal." Poirot gave a small, solemn nod. Poirot gave a small, solemn nod. "The truth, Hastings, is always heavy, but it is better than the silence of falsehood." Outside, the village breathed a little easier, and within the flicker of gaslight and the last sip of warm tea, justice began to settle in it. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape Brackenthorp. settled uneasily into the aftermath of revelation. The Cartwright name, once synonymous with quiet respectability, now hung in the air like smoke after a fire. While Inspector Cawthorne handled Lillian Cartwright's formal questioning at the station, her father, Edwin, had been allowed to return home under supervision, pending formal arraignment, a mistake Poirot had gently but firmly warned against. "She is not the only one we must watch, mon cher Hastings," Poirot had said with a touch of urgency. "When the net tightens, even those who seem resigned may thrash." It was nearly dusk when the first crack in the surface appeared. Sergeant Dorsey, posted outside the Cartwright home, knocked on the guest-house door in a mild state of embarrassment. "Gone, sir," he said, removing his cap. "Mr. Cartwright just walked out through the back garden gate while I was speaking with the housemaid about supper. Didn't take his coat, didn't leave a note, vanished." Poirot stood slowly, like a man with nowhere left to run and yet still trying to run. The search began at once. Hastings joined Inspector Cawthorne and 2 constables as they swept the village periphery. Word spread quickly, and locals peered from behind lace curtains as torches and lanterns bobbed in the streets. The Cartwright house was searched, the estate ledgers re-examined, but Poirot had his own destination in mind, not the train station, not the river path, not even the Cartwright garden shed. He went, instead, to the Brackenthorp Assembly Hall. When the constable on duty questioned him, Poirot merely said, "Because, mon ami, men often return to the scene of their great mistakes, found the side door to the hall unlatched." Inside, the hall was cloaked in a hush so complete that each creak of the floorboards seemed a thunderclap. Poirot moved down the corridor toward the stairwell with the falcon-hilted umbrella in his mind's eye. The metal steps still bore the faintest scar of that fatal evening. And then he saw him. Edwin Cartwright sat alone at the bottom of the stairwell, arms wrapped around his knees, staring at nothing. His jacket was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. In the dim light, he looked like a child, caught in a lie too large for his understanding. "You've come?" Cartwright said softly, not looking up. "Yes," Poirot replied, his voice low but unwavering. "Because you had nowhere else to go." Cartwright didn't move. "I didn't plan to hurt him. I just wanted to scare her, make her rethink. That umbrella, I thought it would be her." Poirot knelt beside him on the lower step. "But you struck too hard. Or perhaps you knew exactly what you were doing, and only afterward called it a mistake." Cartwright covered his face with his hands. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't even know the truth until Lillian told me. About Clara. About the inheritance. She said Benton was going to hand everything to her. We would be erased." Poirot studied him. "Your daughter used your loyalty against you. She planted the seed, fed it with silence. She said Clara had manipulated Philip, that she was tricking him, trying to steal what wasn't hers. I believed her. And when Philip showed up carrying the one symbol that could identify Clara in the dark, I acted," Cartwright finished. "I was already waiting there, in the shadows. When I saw the falcon head, I didn't even hesitate." Poirot rose to his feet. "Come, monsieur, it is over." Cartwright stood slowly, shakily. "I won't run again." "No," Poirot said softly, "because now you understand. It was never the inheritance. It was the fear of irrelevance. That More than greed is what pushed you to kill." As they emerged into the open air, lanterns flickered in the approaching dark. A constable moved forward to escort Cartwright into custody without a word. Back at the guest house, Hastings watched through the window as the wagon rolled away. "So that's the end of him," he said. "No," Poirot said quietly, "only the end of his part in the story. Do you think he truly didn't know who he was killing? I believe he believed he did. And belief, mon ami, when fueled by fear and pride, is a powerful force." Hastings shook his head. And Lillian, she made him into a weapon." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, but remember, weapons can only wound when wielded. She set the path. He walked it." The next morning, a message arrived from London. McInnes and Holt had located a second copy of the Delaford Trust addendum, sealed within a duplicate legal packet, misfiled in the probate archives for over a decade. Poirot opened the envelope with care. Inside was the clause, unmistakably written in Sir Gregory Delaford's hand. In the event of the discovery of a legitimate descendant of Arnold Delaford, said descendant shall be granted beneficiary status over the secondary holdings of the Delaford Trust, with immediate effect upon legal verification. Beneath it, a name handwritten by Sir Gregory himself in later years. Clara Ridley, Doc Poirot, took the news to Clara in person. She sat in the tea-room of the hotel, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. When she read the document, her eyes filled with tears, not of triumph, but of quiet relief. "So it's true," she whispered, "all of it." "Yes," Poirot said, "and now the estate will pass to its rightful heir." "I don't want revenge," she said softly. "I just want peace." "You shall have it," Poirot replied, "though it may come slowly. Time is a great restorer, but only when the truth is allowed to settle." She looked up at him. "Thank you," Poirot bowed. "It is not thanks. I desire, mademoiselle, only truth, and perhaps a small slice of lemon cake." A laugh escaped her lips, a soft, surprised thing, the first in many days. Outside, the sun rose fully over Brackenthorp, casting light where shadows had long lingered. And in that light, Hercule Poirot knew the game of fear and lies had come to an end. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place, though Edwin Cartwright now sat in a guarded cell at the Brackenthorp station, and his daughter awaited formal arraignment in London. There remained in Poirot's mind one unresolved element, one thread that had not been fully pulled, and Poirot, meticulous to the last, could not abide even the smallest tangle in the fabric of the truth. He was not in the fabric of the truth. He was not yet ready for his final gathering. Instead, he returned to Delaford House, requesting one last private audience with Lady Eleanor herself. She received him in the blue sitting-room, a space designed more for effect than comfort, where porcelain figurines stared out from glass cabinets, and everything seemed just slightly more brittle than it should be. Poirot declined tea. He remained standing. "Lady Delaford," he began with studied calm, "this will be our final conversation before the affair concludes. But there is still one matter only you can resolve." She watched him with eyes hard as glass. "If this is about Clara, I've no more to say." "It is not about Clara," Poirot said gently. It is about your husband." Her composure wavered slightly. "Sir Gregory," Poirot continued, "was a man of stature and command, but he carried his family's legacy like a burden, and I believe in his final years he sought to correct a wrong not of your making, but one you helped conceal." "You're speaking of Arnold," she said. Her voice was almost bored, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "I am," Poirot said, "and of the girl who was born as a result of his indiscretion. You always knew. From the moment she came to Brackenthorp as a child, placed with the Ransoms, you knew who she was." Lady Delaford said nothing. "You watched her grow up," Poirot went on, "and in time you took her into your own household. Not out of kindness, but control. You told yourself it was charity, that she owed you. But it was guilt, madame, and fear. For if the truth ever surfaced, your husband's estate, your standing, would pass to her." Still she remained silent. "I do not accuse you of murder," Poirot said. "You are too proud for such crude violence. But you forged the world in which violence became inevitable, and when Philip Benton arrived in Brackenthorp, bringing questions and documents, you acted not to stop him, but to see who would." Her eyes flicked upward, sharp, measured. "Your silence was not protection, madam. It was a dare, lady." Delaford stood suddenly and walked to the window, where the afternoon light cut hard across the angles of her face. "I thought," she said finally, "that if Clara could be kept under my roof, given rules, given structure, she'd forget who she was, or never know." Poirot said nothing. "I saw her become something more, and it terrified me." Her voice cracked just once. "Because I knew, the moment she looked at me like an equal, I knew the past wasn't buried." Poirot stepped forward gently. "You feared she would take everything." "I feared she would replace me," Lady Delaford whispered. "In this house, in this village, in name." Poirot nodded. "And now?" There was a long silence. Then, slowly, she turned to face him. "Now I see she's the only Delaford left who deserves the name." Later that day, Poirot visited the assembly hall for the final time. He moved through the empty chairs, letting his footsteps echo one last time against the wooden floorboards. Then he walked once more to the stairwell, now scrubbed clean, but somehow still haunted. He crouched again, not to examine the scene, but to remember it. Here a man died, not for what he had done, but for what he had discovered. A man who tried, too late, to restore what others had buried. Then Poirot looked upward. At the top of the stairwell, the hallway branched into two paths, one toward the performer's lounge, the other toward the service corridor. It struck him all at once, the final piece. He stood swiftly and walked to the cloakroom. There he examined the outer hinge of the door, still damaged, still barely noticeable. He opened it and reached behind the inner panel. No envelope, no documents, but inside the narrow pocket where the cleaning logbook was kept, he found a paperclip, bent, smooth, rubbed with pressure. Poirot smiled. "Mon pauvre Benton," he murmured, "you did try to hide it, but you hid it too late." Back at the guest house, Hastings was seated with his second cup of tea when Poirot returned. "You look as though you found something," Hastings said, rising. "I have found the last whisper," Poirot replied. "The killer is known, the manipulator exposed, the heir restored. But the motive, the true motive, was only ever fear of change." He paced slowly to the fireplace, hands clasped. They feared scandal. They feared being forgotten. They feared losing control. But the universe, Hastings, does not run on fear. It runs on order. And now, order is restored. Hastings nodded. "Then tomorrow—" "Tomorrow," Poirot said, "we gather them all." That night Clara Ridley stood alone in the rose garden of Delaford House. She wore no coat, only a shawl, and the wind played gently at her skirts. Poirot found her there, as he had hoped. "I hear you're calling everyone together," she said softly. "Yes, tomorrow," she nodded. "I still don't know how to feel." Poirot looked up at the moonlight streaming through the petals. "You will, mademoiselle, in time. I don't want revenge." "You won't get it from me," Poirot said gently. "Only closure." She looked at him then. "Will it ever feel like I belong here?" "You already do," he said. "The house knows. The land knows. Even the ghosts of the Delafords know. It is only you who must believe it." She gave a fragile smile, and Poirot quietly left her to the roses and the silence she had earned. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The next morning broke with a crispness that seemed to clear the lingering fog from both the skies and the minds of Brackenthorp's residents. The sun emerged pale but bright, casting long shadows across the courtyard of the assembly hall, where once again Hercule Poirot had summoned the principal figures for one last meeting. But this time it was not an investigation. It was a reckoning. Inside the hall the seats had been arranged in a half-circle, just as Poirot preferred for such occasions. At the centre stood a single wooden chair, a stage without curtain, a theatre without play, and yet what would unfold here today would be as dramatic as any performance. Lady Eleanor Delaford arrived first, her presence subdued but unmistakably composed. She was dressed in black silk, her mourning no longer performative but sincere. Her eyes met Poirot's briefly before she took her seat in silence. Clara Ridley entered shortly after, accompanied by Hastings. She looked calmer now, more assured, her spine straighter. Something had shifted in her, a quiet strength that Poirot had seen before in those who had faced the abyss and stepped back from it. Then came Inspector Cawthorne, who took up position near the rear, arms folded, face unreadable. Last of all, two uniformed constables led in Lillian Cartwright. Her wrists were uncuffed, but her posture was guarded. She walked with precise dignity, chin high, as though daring anyone to see her as diminished. When she saw Clara, she said nothing, but her eyes lingered, hard and cold. Poirot remained standing until the room had fully settled. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice measured but commanding, "you are gathered here not for judgment, but for truth. There are courts for the law, there are prisons for the guilty, but there are very few places where motive, action, and consequence are allowed to meet with clarity." He took a slow step forward. "I present to you the full and final account of the murder of Mr. Philip Benton." No one moved. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. Mr. Benton came to Brackenthorp bearing knowledge, a truth hidden for decades, that Clara Ridley was, in fact, the direct descendant of Arnold Delaford, and thereby the rightful secondary heir to the Delaford Trust. Lady Delaford closed her eyes briefly. Clara sat straighter. He intended to present this information through legal channels, but before he could, he was intercepted. And that, mes amis, is where deception began. Poirot looked toward Lillian. Miss Cartwright was the first to realize the implications of Benton's visit. She discovered Clara's lineage, likely through overheard conversations, or perhaps a glimpse of Benton's correspondence. She recognized the threat, financial, social, personal, and she responded not with violence, but with manipulation. Lillian's jaw flexed, but she said nothing. She planted the idea in her father's mind that Clara was attempting to steal the family legacy. She allowed fear to grow in him like ivy, and at the same time orchestrated the theft of Lady Delaford's umbrella, a known visual signature. She ensured it would be seen in the hand of Philip Benton. The stairwell, the dim corridor, the silhouette, all arranged. Poirot turned to the others. And so Mr. Cartwright struck. Believing he was defending his family, he killed a man who was never his enemy. He let the silence settle before continuing. But the plot did not end with Benton's death. No, what followed was equally calculated. A planted letter in Clara's drawer, a staged theft in her room, a ring placed to suggest guilt, all designed not to create chaos, but to build a case. Slowly, carefully, inevitably. Lillian finally spoke, her voice steady. And yet, the only person who struck the blow was my father. Poirot nodded. We. But you lit the fuse. Lillian looked away. Poirot addressed the room now, voice softening. We ask often why people commit murder. Jealousy, greed, revenge, they are familiar answers. But here it was fear. Fear of change, of being erased, of losing control. He looked at Lady Delaford. You carried that fear, madam. You suppressed a truth for decades because it would undo the version of life you worked so hard to maintain. She met his gaze. And I paid for it. Poirot's gaze shifted to Clara. And you, mademoiselle, paid for it too. In silence, in subservience. But now, the truth is yours. Rump said nothing, but tears glimmered in her eyes. She wasn't crying, only holding everything that had come before, with quiet grace. Poirot walked to the chair at the center of the room and sat. You see, mes amis, truth does not come to those who demand it. It comes to those willing to listen when it whispers. And Mr. Benton, he listened, at great cost. Inspector Cawthorne stepped forward now. The arrest report will name Edwin Cartwright as the killer, and Lillian Cartwright as a co-conspirator in obstruction and manipulation. The Crown may decide whether she faces additional charges. Lillian sat still, her eyes locked forward, not defiant, not broken, just finished. Poirot stood and walked to Clara. Your name, mademoiselle, is not just Clara Ridley. It is Clara Delaford, and what was denied to you by silence has now been returned by truth. She nodded slowly. Lady Delaford stood, unprompted. She walked over to Clara, haltingly, as though each step cost her something. Then To the astonishment of all, she extended her hand. "I don't ask forgiveness," she said, "but I will not fight you, not any more." Clara looked at the hand and took it, not in triumph, but in closure. Poirot turned to Hastings and gave a faint, satisfied nod. The final gathering had served its purpose. Not for drama, not even for justice, but for understanding. Chapter 16. The Great Reveal. The morning after the final gathering, a mist lingered in the hedgerows of Brackenthorp, reluctant to depart. But within Whitehaven Mansions, temporarily occupied by Hercule Poirot and his ever-faithful companion Captain Hastings, there was no fog, only clarity. Poirot sat at the writing desk, pen poised, composing his final report to the Home Office. Outside, the sounds of carts and boots and the clinking of milk bottles painted the village as restored. But Poirot knew better. Restored, yes, but changed too. Hastings stirred his tea. "That was quite something yesterday," he said, glancing over the edge of the newspaper. "Not often you get a woman like Lady Delaford to admit fault in public." Poirot's pen paused, mid-sentence. "She did not admit it for public approval, Hastings. She admitted it because she was exhausted. A life of concealment leaves one perpetually guarding shadows. Still," Hastings added, "you've done it again. Solved the mystery, exposed the killers, untangled generations of lies, without a gun, a chase, or a single shout." Poirot gave a small, proud smile. "Ah, but the greatest chase, mon ami, is not across rooftops. It is through the minds of men and women, and the loudest scream is the silence that follows truth." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was Inspector Cawthorne. He stepped inside, hat in hand. "You'll be pleased to hear that the Metropolitan Crown Prosecutor's Office will be pursuing formal charges against Lillian Cartwright for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Her father's case is already being handled, manslaughter with intent. Manslaughter with intent." Poirot rose and offered a slight bow. "And Clara Ridley? She's been confirmed as the rightful secondary heir. The trust documents have been verified. Probate court will finalize the transition in the coming weeks." "And Lady Delaford?" Hastings asked. Cawthorne's face softened. "She's agreed to vacate the estate once Clara is legally instated. No protest, no challenge, just quiet acceptance." Poirot nodded, and Cawthorne excused himself soon after, leaving the two men in a house suddenly very still. By early afternoon, Poirot made one final visit to Delaford House. He found Clara in the west parlour, seated by a window where afternoon light warmed the tapestry of the room. She stood as he entered, her expression a mixture of composure and wonder. "Everything's changing," she said softly. "It feels as though I've stepped into someone else's life." Poirot inclined his head. "No, mademoiselle. You are merely stepping into your own. One that was delayed, not denied." Clara gestured for him to sit, and they did so in companionable quiet for a time. Then she asked, "Do you believe Lady Delaford truly regrets it? Or is she just tired?" "Both," Poirot replied without hesitation. "She lived in a fortress of her own design. The problem with fortresses, mademoiselle, is that they keep others out, but they also trap those within." Clara looked down at her hands. "I almost feel sorry for her." Poirot smiled faintly. Compassion, when earned, is a mark of strength, not softness. She nodded slowly. Philip believed in this, in me. He died trying to give me this truth. Poirot's eyes softened. He died because he dared to disturb the balance others had worked decades to preserve. That is not a small thing. He reached into his coat and withdrew a single folded paper, a copy of the original letter Benton had written, tucked away, and only now ready to be seen. I believe he meant for you to have this. She accepted it, eyes wet, but not broken. Thank you. Poirot rose, and this time she did not stop him. He left her there, a woman who now sat not as an ornament, not as a companion, but as a rightful heir, a Delaford. That evening, back at the guest-house, Poirot sat beside Hastings in front of a gently crackling fire. The air smelled faintly of ash and tea and something warm, like justice. Hastings leaned back. It still stuns me. So many people hiding things, not just from each other, but from themselves. Poirot smiled. C'est la nature humaine, Hastings. We tell ourselves stories to survive, that we are in control, that we are good, that we are owed what we have. But truth is relentless. It waits buried until someone with enough courage unearths it. And in this case, that someone was Philip Benton, and Clara Ridley. Hastings shook his head. It's a strange world. Poirot gave a small nod. Strange, but also just, when seen clearly. He reached for his watch, checked it, then folded his hands. It is time to close this case, Hastings. No dramatic final speech. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Oh no, mon ami. The drama is done. The curtain has fallen. The applause is silence. And silence, when the truth has spoken, is the grandest ovation of all. Outside, the lights in Brackenthorp twinkled on one by one. A new season was beginning, and at the very edge of it, in a house that once belonged to secrets, now lived a woman who knew exactly who she was. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice in the Days that followed. Brackenthorp adjusted with the quiet resilience of old English villages. Slowly, cautiously, and with an air of discretion that disguised the depth of transformation taking place behind the hedgerows and curtained windows. The Brackenthorp Gazette published a subdued article titled Inheritance Clarified, Tragedy Concluded, in which names were carefully omitted, but the consequences were unmistakably described. No one in the village needed names. They had all lived the story. Lillian Cartwright was transported to London under guard for her formal indictment. Her face, once a fixture at every society function and charity tea, had vanished from view. Those who had praised her efficiency and poise now lowered their voices when speaking of her, as though fearing their previous admiration would mark them complicit in her deception. Edwin Cartwright remained in custody, though his mental state had declined sharply since the confession. Some said he barely spoke anymore. Others claimed he kept asking for the right umbrella, as if he could turn back time by correcting a mistake so small, so tragically human. Lady Eleanor Delaford continued to reside in the west wing of the Ahétoufi-de-Hunim estate as a guest, no longer a sovereign of the house, but a presence within it. Clara had insisted she remain, not out of obligation, but compassion. I cannot undo the past, she told Poirot quietly one afternoon, "but I don't believe justice is vengeance. And besides, the house is large enough for two." Poirot had smiled at that, with a warmth reserved for those rare moments when his belief in order aligned perfectly with the fragile nobility of the human heart. On a grey morning not long after, Poirot and Hastings returned to London. The journey by train was quiet. Poirot read a slim volume of French poetry, while Hastings stared out the window at the countryside slipping by. Eventually, Hastings turned. "Do you think Clara will be all right?" Poirot looked up. "She will be, yes, because she now knows who she is. That is the greatest armor against sorrow." "But surely she'll be haunted by what happened, by what it cost." "Of course," Poirot said, "but regret is not ruin, mon ami. It is memory tempered by meaning." They rode in silence for a moment before Hastings added, "You were right about them all, even Lillian, especially Lillian." Poirot sighed softly. Mademoiselle Cartwright was brilliant but misdirected. She feared irrelevance more than prison. She saw Clara not as family, but as erasure, and so she crafted a crime not of blood, but of narrative, bending perception until her father believed he was the last shield protecting their legacy. Hastings gave a low whistle. "But she never expected you." Poirot smiled. "No one ever does, until it is too late." Back in London, Poirot received a letter from Clara Ridley, written in careful, graceful script on cream stationery, bearing the new crest of Delaford House. "Monsieur Poirot, it has taken me some time. Monsieur Poirot, it has taken me some time to find the words, but I want to thank you, not for restoring my name or my inheritance, but for helping me see that silence is not the same as peace. My future still feels unfamiliar, but I am no longer afraid of it. The roses are blooming again. I thought you'd want to know that. Yours sincerely, Clara Delaford Poirot." Folded the letter with the gentleness one reserves for rare things, then tucked it into his bureau drawer alongside a collection of case notes and pressed violet petals from an earlier visit. He sat for a while, alone, the ticking of the mantel clock the only sound in the room. Then he whispered, "Bravo, mademoiselle." Later that week, Poirot was summoned to the Royal Courts of Justice to provide testimony before the Crown Prosecutor. He delivered his account with clinical elegance, neither theatrical nor aloof, but precise, layered, and irrefutable. The prosecutor was particularly struck by one sentence. In this case, murder was not driven by hatred. It was committed out of misidentification. The true weapon was not the stare, nor the blow, but the manipulation of perception. And that, mesdames et messieurs, is what made it so dangerous. His testimony was accepted without challenge. By the time he returned home, the verdict had been issued. Lillian Cartwright, guilty of conspiracy, forgery, and obstruction, sentenced to 5 years in Holloway Prison. Edwin Cartwright, guilty of manslaughter, sentenced to 10 years, with eligibility for psychiatric review and early release on medical grounds. Neither sentence brought satisfaction. Poirot did not expect them to, but they brought order, and in Poirot's world, that was as close to justice as one could come. On a rainy evening in late April, Poirot dined alone. He arranged his place setting with geometric precision. Fork exactly, parallel to the edge, napkin at a 45-degree angle, candlewick trimmed to match the height of the wineglass. A small indulgence in symmetry, as always. At the end of the meal, he lifted his glass and whispered to the empty room. To Philip Benton, who listened, and to Clara Delaford, who dared to speak. He sipped once, then gently placed the glass down. A chime from the clock, a flicker of candlelight, and Hercule Poirot quietly let the mystery rest. Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. Spring returned to Brackenthorp in gentle stages, buds pushing through old stone walls, the wisteria curling once again around the eaves of Delaford House, and a warmer light falling through the windows where shadows had once ruled. The village did not speak often of the affair that had shaken it. No open discussions in the pub, no letters to the Gazette. But everyone knew, and the silence was not denial. It was acknowledgment. In time, the quiet settled again into routine, but not the same routine. Clara Delaford, no longer Miss Ridley, had assumed her place as mistress of the estate, though she carried the title without airs. Her changes were subtle. The gardens were reopened to the public twice a month. The west wing, once reserved for portraits and cold memory, was refurbished into a literacy hall for village children. And perhaps most notably, the imposing portrait of Sir Gregory was moved from the central corridor to a quieter side hall, replaced by a sunlit painting of the rose garden. "I thought it was time," she had told Poirot with a small smile. The house needed light in the centre. Poirot, visiting one final time before his departure to the Continent, had offered no argument, only approval. "You have chosen well, mademoiselle," he said, standing in the great hallway where so many footsteps had once echoed in secrets. "A home should reflect truth, not just lineage." She nodded. "And truth is harder to curate than marble." He looked at her fondly, but infinitely more beautiful. They walked together through the garden paths, pausing before a bench newly installed beneath the oldest tree in the orchard. "He would have liked this, I think," Clara said. "You mean Mr. Benton?" She nodded. "He always said places should remember kindness, not power, that it makes them harder to forget." Poirot considered that. He was correct. Power lingers in fear. Kindness lingers in form. She looked at him with quiet gratitude. "I wouldn't have gotten here without you." "No," Poirot said gently. "You would have. I merely turned the mirror. You did the seeing." A soft wind stirred the grass. Then Poirot turned to her, his tone shifting. "There is one final thing, mademoiselle. A small mystery, unresolved. One which, though minor, intrigued me none the less." She looked intrigued. "Oh?" Poirot produced from his breast pocket a small envelope, aged, unsealed, and hand-addressed to E.D. She took it carefully, opened it, and scanned the page. Her face changed. "It's a letter," she whispered, "from Sir Gregory to Edwin Cartwright. He wrote it before he died." Poirot nodded. "The original was thought destroyed. I found it wedged behind the false panel in the cloakroom ledger box, where Benton likely intended to hide it." Clara read it silently. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with something weightless. "Relief, he wanted me to know," she said. "He wasn't blind to it all." The letter was brief. a single paragraph. But in it, Sir Gregory expressed his regret for how his brother's mistakes had been handled, his belief that the girl left behind was owed more than protection. She was owed dignity, and he concluded with one line: "Do not let her become a secret. Let her become the future." Poirot folded his hands behind his back. It was not murder that defined this case, Mademoiselle Delaford. It was erasure, and your presence here now is its undoing. A week later, Hercule Poirot left Brackenthorp. The train station, Hastings met him with 2 tickets and a question. "Geneva again?" he asked, boarding alongside Poirot. Poirot gave a light nod. "For rest, and a little order. The world, she is messy again." As the train pulled away, Hastings turned in his seat. "Do you think people will ever stop hiding things?" Poirot smiled. "No, Hastings. But I do believe, eventually, they learn that hiding is a kind of death." He looked out at the passing fields, sunlit and green, and that the truth, when finally spoken, is not a thunderclap, but a whisper heard at last. The whistle blew, the wheels turned, and the great Hercule Poirot leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, moustaches perfectly groomed as justice once more had been done.